The film begins by showing a woman in Italy who meets on a train with a man named Gregor. This woman is Nadia, the spy agent from Citadel. Nadia is watching a man named Gregor, who is known to be carrying uranium to be sold to bad people. Nadia appears to be guided by Bernard from a distance. She is also equipped with sophisticated equipment. But soon, a man came to Nadia, a man named Mason, who turned out to be an elite agent who also became Nadia's partner. At first, Nadia didn't expect to be paired again as a team because they had yet to meet for a long time. Even Mason has also seen Mason wear a ring. It turns out to be just under the guise of a mission. And then, when the two of them were engrossed in a conversation, Gregor got up from his seat and moved to another train car. Mason moved to follow. But Nadia immediately held and kissed him for camouflage. Because there are Gregor's subordinate guards in there, Nadia asks Mason not to make trouble for their mission. Nadia then went to follow Gregor, who was immediately followed by Gregor's subordinate, and of course, Mason was behind, following the man and asking him to face him. Mason brings that man to the toilet, and there is a fight. The fierce fight is seen between them until both of them look tired. Meanwhile, it was seen that Nadia had started to approach Gregor and asked him to talk casually. Gregor was happy to welcome Nadia. In the middle of their conversation, without much time, Nadia immediately points a gun at Gregor, making him surprised. Still, Gregor was only pretending to be astonished because Gregor knows and Gregor on purpose to trap Citadel. Gregor also shows many people of Citadel who have died, and Gregor's men immediately point their guns at Nadia, making Nadia only silent. Gregor was also proud to be able to meet Nadia because he had wanted to kill the Citadel agents. Besides that, Mason succeeds in finishing his opponent by the win the fight. Mason was on time to come to the train, and immediately he shoots Gregor's people so that Nadia can move from her place. And the fighting ensued, which was very hard to win by those two Citadel agents. And when Mason sees Nadia's wound there, Nadia immediately tells if they are trapped. And when Mason contacted Bernard to the evacuation, turned out to be Gregor was still alive and said that the Manticore group would always find Citadel. Gregor then detonated the bomb, cutting the train cars off and making them all bounce off the explosion. In short, it was seen that Mason woke up and was in the Italian hospital room. When he woke up, Mason seemed shocked and confused because he was in a bound state. And not long after, the doctor came to explain the train explosion incident, which put Mason in the hospital. But it turned out that Mason had lost his memory, so he could not remember what happened to him. And then the doctor gave an ID belonging to Mason named Conroy, and also a wedding ring that was found in Mason's pocket. In addition, the doctor explained that the American consulate could not find any family or relatives about him. The scene moved to 8 years later. It shows Mason with his Conroy identity, already married, having a wife named Abby and a daughter named Hendrix. When they gathered, Mason saw an explosion news television broadcast, which instantly made his mind suddenly remember a glimpse of the incident when on the train with Nadia. And then Mason came to a doctor for memory therapy, because now he feels he has to know who he is, because it has been several years after the accident when no one was looking for Mason's whereabouts. That makes him curious about his own identity data, that there is a thing hiding. Especially in Mason's mind, there is always Nadia's reflection on his memories, which until now, he didn't recognize her. Moved to Virginia, America, a foreign minister named Harold came to the residence of a woman who was the British ambassador. The woman's name is Dahlia. She tells Harold about the Citadel that fell 8 years ago. Then, her secret treasure is buried in a box that is secured on a black site, and inside it is sure that there is an agent's identity until the nuclear codes. Dahlia knows that the CIA has found the ex-Citadel box. So Dahlia asked Harold to tell him, not as a foreign minister and ambassador, but as a Manticore group, because Dahlia had a part in the Manticore. At first, Harold refused to tell because he felt he was no longer part of it, but Dahlia threatened him with the safety of his children and wife. Then forcibly, Harold divulges the secret of the CIA to Dahlia. And then Dahlia contacted her subordinate named David and Anders. It was seen that those two people had just killed many people at a wedding. Dahlia deliberately got her assistants to take the Citadel Xbox, which is now on the black side of the CIA. Anders and David were ready to carry out their duties, and now the scene is in Chicago. Bernard was seen holding the Manticore hostage. There Bernard was playing around until he killed them one by one, and for the last person, Bernard received information that the Manticore now knew where the Citadel Xbox was, and will immediately take it for the sake of the nuclear code. After hearing that Bernard also kills him, as long as he gets information about Mason, who he has tracked then, Bernard prepares to meet him. Besides that, Mason, seen at his house, is observing the scars on his body. Not long after, Abby comes and asks him to do an adult activity. But when they kiss, Mason is suddenly shocked because Nadia's figure reappears in his mind. That was left when his daughter called because she had a bad dream. And then, when Mason goes to sleep, he imagines again about Nadia. And the explosion at that time made him unable to sleep, and he went straight to the warehouse to look back at the passport and ring he had found with himself. Shortly, Abby called Mason, who told him that a stranger was in her house. He rushed over to it, and it turned out that the stranger was Bernard, who immediately beat up Mason and asked Mason and his family got into the car. Because they felt threatened, Mason finally went down, and in the car, Bernard gave gas to their seats, making them all fall asleep. The next day, it was seen that Dahlia's men and the troops were already at the black side of the CIA and quickly managed to take the ex-Citadel box. Meanwhile, Dahlia, who was indeed the ambassador, was broadcast live with one of the media discussing limiting the power of a country. It was when Dahlia emphasized her pride regarding Britain's position and revealed that she would strike back at any entity that threatened democracy. And besides that, Dahlia also mocks the journalist who interviews her by saying Russia asset. Shortly, Dahlia received news that the Xbox Citadel was under security and had to be immediately taken to New York to decode. And we moved to Bernard's headquarters. There, Bernard explained if carrying Mason was for Mason's safety and his family. Bernard also introduces his ex-wife and presents the way like that, which is to take Mason, but this is for his good, and will tell who the honest Mason's identity is. That Mason is looking for while showing a photo of Bernard, who was with Mason first, so that Mason believes that. Bernard slowly introduces Mason's identity, which is the spies. And the Conroy's identity were Bernard's creations. Then no one would know if they are traced, and every wound on Mason's body is a wound of war. And he is told that Mason is an elite agent from Citadel, who is not loyal to any nation, but only to the safety and security of everyone. And then Bernard informs also that his opponent was the Manticore, and the Manticore fell when the Citadel collapsed and killed thousands of spies of the Citadel. The Manticore itself was founded by some of the wealthiest people in the world, so Bernard explained Mason's intention now taken. Namely, Bernard needed Mason's help because the Xbox of Citadel containing all the secrets was stolen by the Manticore, who is currently on the way to New York to open the box. The danger is that if the Manticore manages to open it, every nuclear weapon is in their grasp. Bernard asks Mason to come to New York and retrieve the box before the Manticore opens it. When Mason felt he was not an agent, Bernard immediately tested him by throwing a knife at him. Mason reflexively caught it casually. Bernard said that was how Mason's agent with his ability. And then Bernard tells if Mason has a great partner, and she is Nadia. At the incident of the explosion of the train, Nadia was contacted Bernard but not connected. The possibility is Nadia died. Seeing Nadia's face made Mason slightly sure if she was an agent, because the face who often appears is Nadia. Then, Mason agreed to join Bernard for the safety of his daughter and wife. And then the scene moves to 8 years earlier, when the train explosion occurred. It seems that Nadia survived and managed to get away from the blast. The set continued by showing a flashback to 8 years earlier, when the train explosion occurred in Italy. It appears that Nadia was still alive and was crawling, trying to endure the pain from the wound on her leg. Nadia also tried to contact Bernard and reported that everything was a trap. Citadel had been infiltrated and tried to kill her. Now Mason disappeared. Bernard seems not to have heard Nadia's words. He then told Nadia that Bernard started the backup, which is Nadia would lose her memories. Then Nadia had to do the things that needed to be done right. And then Nadia went to the road holding her wound. Luckily, she saw a car driving towards her, so she stopped the car and asked for help. Until when the man who owned the vehicle got down, suddenly Nadia fainted. In short, Nadia woke up from her faint. Apparently, she had been taken to the man's house and treated. But what surprised Nadia was that she was handcuffed to the bed. The man who saw Nadia woke up immediately and asked if he was watchful of Nadia because of the severe wound from the shot. Nadia then tried to calm the man down so he wasn't afraid of her and took him to the hospital for treatment. She heard the man refuse. Finally, Nadia released her prowess and was able to let go of the chain, and they fought. In that fight, Nadia seemed desperate and almost died, but with her prowess, she could reverse the situation and kill the man. After that, Bernard's backup system suddenly started to react. So Nadia immediately wrote in her hand the writing to go to Valencia. Instantly, she fainted. When she woke up, Nadia had lost her memories and looked very confused. She read the writing on her hand to leave to Valencia, then saw her pseudonym identity passport Charlotte. So Nadia went to Valencia with her pseudonym identity. Moving on 8 years later, showing Mason, who had now been told that he was a spy, also said that identity to his wife, Abby. It has seemed Abby didn't believe it and guessed that the possibility was just made up. But Mason feels that identity is his authentic self. Besides that, Mason convinced Abby that if he got the Citadel box, then Abby and his daughter would still be protected. Meanwhile, Joe asked Bernard not to tell Mason about Abby's identity, which is a secret also behind that. The next day, Bernard and Mason went to a building where the secret lab, Manticore, was located. Bernard told Mason to immediately enter the lab with the disguise he had set to get the Citadel box. Mason, who was still confused, asked Bernard to explain his plan. But Bernard ordered Mason to go straight in and Bernard, who would guide him. Mason began to enter the building through various sophisticated security systems. But apparently, Mason was followed by the Manticore people, so there was a fight. Mason easily beat him and fled from there carrying a Citadel box. David realizes it was an act of Mason, who turns out to be still alive, rushes to chase and track down the two. David also reported this to Dahlia. Hearing this, Dahlia was furious and asked David to bring back the box with Mason alive. Meanwhile, it was seen Bernard and Mason were so happy with the box they managed to bring. But Mason was so disappointed in Bernard after knowing that now the Manticore would continue to look for Mason's whereabouts, who reappeared. Apart from that, Bernard says Mason's memory is in the box. Mason also tried to open the box. He took one of the liquid capsules to restore his memory. But it turned out that they had been tracked down by David, which is now not far from them, and suddenly Bernard was shot. Mason, who was shocked, suddenly going out and take the box. After a shootout, Mason can take another car and flees from there. At the same time, Bernard, who was dying, taken away by David and the Manticore people. Back to Mason, where they feel safe. He rechecks his memory capsule for an injection. However, it turns out that because of the incident earlier, the liquid has been wasted. Mason so resigns because he would no longer be able to remember himself. Even so, suddenly in the box, it gave a notification about the agent who was still alive in Valencia. And that was Nadia. And immediately, Mason told his wife he had to clean everything up. He also went to Valencia to meet Nadia. Arriving in Valencia, it took a little while for Mason to find Nadia's whereabouts. But Nadia, who had lost her memory, clearly didn't recognize Mason and tried to escape Mason. Seeing this, Mason also tried to bring up the incident 8 years ago in Italy, which made Nadia want to talk to him. Nadia only remembers the incident with the stranger man who died first and thought Mason was the police who came for her for that case. Even Mason, who still doesn't fully remember, tried to introduce himself as a great spy, and Nadia was his partner. Nadia, who was confused and afraid of Mason, made her shout. Nadia's voice was detected by the Xbox and made it opened. Mason also asked Nadia to take his memory capsule tube to inject it so that Nadia would remember. But at the same time, suddenly someone shot them. It turned out to be David's subordinate, and then, when they were both about to run away, it turns out it was David who beat both of them. The fight 1-on-2 fight begins. Two agents who still have lost their memories, it seems they still haven't recovered their strength, so they can't keep up with David. Still, when the two of them are pressed, and Mason almost be killed by David, Nadia immediately initiates to inject the memory capsule, making her strength seem to be back. Without wasting much time, Nadia immediately beat David until he was unconscious, and then Nadia asked Mason to hurry to leave because she had already remembered everything. Meanwhile, David, who seemed to be conscious, immediately informed that Nadia was still alive to Dahlia. It appeared that Dahlia was so angry at David that, and told him to directly bring the Xbox and kill those two Citadel agents. They were also seen at Dahlia's residence. Apparently, Bernard was already in Dahlia's hands. Arrogantly, Dahlia told Bernard that she would soon get the Citadel box, even confident that Bernard could defect to become a Manticore. The scene then shows Bernard, who has now become a prisoner of Dahlia. Dahlia didn't hesitate to order her men to torture Bernard all out. Besides that, Nadia took Mason to the Citadel's safe house in Caceres, Spain. Previously, Nadia ensured that David accidentally installed the tracker chip in the Xbox, and now they will not be found by the Manticore people. There, Nadia immediately treated the wound on Mason's body and pulled out the bullet. It seemed Mason always asked about Mason's figure first and whether Mason used to be close to Nadia. But Nadia said they were not that close. And then Nadia asked about Mason during his disappearance. Mason is talking about himself now. He has a wife and a daughter. Hearing this story, Nadia seemed to have a jealous face. And then the scene flashed back to 10 years ago, when the Citadel had not fallen in Utah. Mason came to Bernard at the Citadel's headquarters. Bernard explains that if someone named Haston creates a new virus that will cause a hazardous outbreak, and then Grace explains all those things to them and explains the mission strategy to steal the virus before it is released. Mason will also get help from one of the agents in the field because the security system is so tight with fully armed guards. The next day in Aaron, Mason started to act and stole the virus package. Even so, he has to fight with many enemies chasing him. He was having a hard time and kept trying to escape from the enemy's encirclement, guided by Carter. He could see that at the edge of the snow, Mason was surrounded by the enemy. But suddenly the new agent that Bernard had previously mentioned, Nadia, helped him. The two of them immediately joined forces to face the enemy. At that moment, Mason has difficulties because an explosion hits him. Luckily, Nadia was able to save and take him away. They both survived to the headquarters. At the base, they also made initial introductions, which turned out to be Nadia, not a new agent, because her parents were also Citadel. So Grace deliberately asked Nadia to help Mason on that mission. Back today at the safe house of Citadel, Nadia was seen opening the Citadel server and sending a message there. It turned out that someone was replying to her message. On the other side, it seemed Bernard was talking to Dahlia, who kept provoking him. It was known that Bernard and Dahlia had worked together at the United Nations, and Bernard knew very well that Dahlia was a sociopath. And then Dahlia shows the Citadel's AI system that can track uranium levels worldwide, and now she mines it. Even though Dahlia can't access the system, she's been trying for years. Therefore, Dahlia ordered that Bernard tell the password to access the system that Bernard had created. However, it was clear that Bernard didn't tell her and insulted Dahlia, and Bernard was not afraid to die if killed. Cruelty, Dahlia threatened Bernard and Mason's families. It turned out to know the whereabouts by the Manticore. On the other side, Bernard and Mason's daughters were playing together. Bernard's daughter, older than Mason's daughter, gives Hendrix a penknife as a gift from her mother. With that, Abby chats with Joe, and Joe asks about the beginning of the introduction between Abby and Mason. Abby says she met Mason while undergoing memory therapy at the hospital, where they were both on medication. Back to Dahlia, who continued to provoke Bernard. She said the Citadel seemed to want to create a new order, but was to destroy it. The evidence was when Dahlia managed to catch Carter. He admitted it and defected to Citadel. Bernard was surprised and asked Carter's whereabouts, but Dahlia didn't respond and instead called a doctor to torture Bernard. Until Bernard's teeth, she destroys them. It wasn't enough that Dahlia also called Anders to torture Bernard even worse. When Anders wanted to drill his head, Bernard suddenly said if a woman is loved by Anders named Briley, who was still alive. When he heard this, Anders ensured that it was just Bernard's trick so that he would not be tortured. Bernard then asked Anders to bring his cell phone to prove that. Moved to the Citadel safe house, Nadia asked Mason to come back to save his family. But Mason didn't want to because if this was done, because he felt that his family would not be safe, that Mason must be with Nadia to finish everything. Mason asks Nadia to teach him to be the old Mason and tells Nadia that if red signals are on the Xbox, he doesn't know what it means. Nadia rushed to open the Xbox and saw a video of Carter's recording around 4 last month. He asked for help because he was in an emergency at Fest. It turns out that Nadia also knows the place because she was tortured when she was undercover. It was discovered that the place was managed by a Portuguese crime boss named Balduino. Then, maybe Manticore will use Balduino to torture Carter to get the Xbox of Citadel. Nadia also had to save Carter, but had to meet Balduino to be able to hack and steal his access code. Besides that, Nadia felt that she couldn't meet Balduino because Nadia didn't like him. Because Nadia killed Balduino's sibling, Mason had to meet him because he was close to Balduino. They went to Morocco. Mason went to Balduino, guided by Nadia, who was outside the place and tried to hack through the lighter brought by Mason. Mason met Balduino directly as if asking for help to get into the commander of the armed forces office to impress him. But there, Balduino looks and hands Mason to the Manticore because the pay is enormous. Balduino also asked about Nadia, who Balduino knew was Mason's lover. Casually, Mason said if Nadia had died during the explosion tragedy in Italy. Suddenly, Balduino asks if Mason is in vain still working for Nadia. Nadia has betrayed Mason because Nadia is an intruder from the Manticore. Nadia heard it and asked Mason to leave immediately because the download was finished. Before Mason goes, the commotion between Mason and Balduino's son, and he manages to escape there. After that, on the way, Mason questioned Balduino's intentions about Nadia, and that there were similarities that Bernard discussed a person in Citadel who defected and whose identity still needed to be discovered. Nadia said that Balduino was a liar, and if Nadia was a betrayal, it would be impossible for Mason to stay alive, and also didn't want to save Carter. Move to Bernard, who shows Mason's family photo to Anders. It turns out that a woman named Brilly, who loved by Anders, is Abby, Eka Mason's wife. Bernard also explains to Anders if Brilly's name is Abby, married to Mason. Bernard then asks Anders to take him out, so he will bring Anders to meet the woman and will tell everything. The scene starts by showing Nadia and Mason was already in Morocco, to be precise at the black side of Manticore. They both started sneaking in there and looked at Mason with little doubt, because it would kill many people. Nadia reassured him that Mason used to get used to it, and then both of them came in, and there was a fight. One by one, the Manticore people were paralyzed by the two of them, but it was seen that Nadia was the one who was more dominant in controlling the fight than Mason. Even so, Nadia still tried to kill the entire Manticore gang. Nadia especially continued to protect Mason, who ran out of bullets. They also managed to finish off all of them. And then Mason and Nadia opened a door allegedly where Carter's agent was locked up. When the two of them opened it, of course, there was Carter inside, but what surprised them was Carter being scared and asking if all of this was your behavior while looking at the two of them. Mason was confused, questioning what he had done before. And then the scene moved to 10 years earlier, set in Paris, France. Nadia and Mason had just finished with the adult scene. Nadia jokingly said that Mason was not the only person who had slept with her, but Mason casually believed that only he was the best to give satisfaction. And then Nadia said she brought one of the level's 1 agents into the team and Grace approved it, and it was known by Mason. Also, if Nadia had another mission besides being carried out with Mason. Nadia told Mason that the agent who would later join was named Celeste, whoever saved Nadia. And then at the headquarters of Citadel, Nadia introduces Celeste to Mason. On the first day of the mission it started. Mason and Nadia immediately gave briefings Celeste discussing Anders and David Manticore. It was known that Anders was more dangerous because Anders was the brain that makes war technology. Then what Citadel has to get it is an Anders technological framework called the OS key. It was known that the OS key could hack the entire country's infrastructure. In another sense, with the OS key, it would easily take the country hostage. Therefore, Celeste is assigned to impersonate someone who will come with Anders' life to steal the OS key. When it's finished in stealing it, Celeste starts doing undercover missions to go to a bar where Anders is indeed there. Celeste is disguised as a woman named Brilly and quickly gets acquainted with Anders. Shortly after 2 weeks they know each other and are getting closer. So, it's not uncommon to do an adult activity. And it's also seen that Anders has started to love Brilly because almost wherever Anders goes beside him, there is always her. Anders, who has been blinded by love, never realized that the woman who is always by himself continues to collect every preparation code. Who made it Anders to improve the OS key. And every information development Celeste or Brilly obtained continued to be reported to Mason. Then at one time in London, after Mason had intercourse with Nadia, he immediately contacted Celeste to ask for a progress report. But it turned out that after several times until around 3 months, Celeste never reported and never read the sign that Mason gave. Apart from that, Mason also received news that Celeste's brother, David, was in trouble and was being chased by dangerous people. With this, Mason felt that Celeste was in trouble, and Mason thought that Celeste could even sell the OS key, of course at a high price. And Mason decided to delegate the operation team directly to the location. Even though Nadia looked, she disagreed. It was also seen Celeste entered a lab room of the OS key and took the item into her bag, which she immediately hid in the toilet. But this was discovered by David, who immediately beat and tried to kill her. And at the same time, the team where sent Mason had arrived and broke into the location. With the incident, Carter reported to Mason that at the location of the shootout, Celeste was alive and safe. The operations team ably brought Anders while David disappeared somewhere. Mason was angry because the operations team said the OS key wasn't there either. Suddenly, Mason gets a message that says that the secret package is safe and never says anything about this. And then at the base, it looks like Anders has just been secured in a state of injury. Grace, who knows if the O's key is lost, asks Mason to solve everything immediately, because it was he who led the mission, and then Mason directly interrogated Celeste. Mason asked about the whereabouts of the missing O's key. Celeste says she didn't know because the O's key was safe in her bag. While in her bag, found by the operation team, and there was nothing in it, and just found the fake one. Celeste, who felt pressured and suspected Mason of taking the O's key, now felt annoyed, and continued to blame Nadia for not helping her because she didn't take it. Mason continued to suspect Celeste until shown David's brother, who knows it is an economic problem. Then the assumption from Mason is Celeste purposely sold the O's key to help David. But Celeste emphasized again that she didn't take it and had nothing to do with David. Mason, who didn't believe it, immediately pressed and threatened her by killing David. That was immediately stopped by Nadia, who felt Mason was too outrageous. Nadia believed if Celeste didn't take the O's key, and probably the person who found the key was David, then taken it away. They were now discussing the fate of Celeste after this, but Nadia didn't join the discussion because she had to interrogate Anders. Grace argued that Nadia must believe in Celeste because she once saved Nadia. Mason kept emphasizing that Celeste had deceived everyone. Then Mason requested that Celeste be erased from her memory and placed in a safe house. Grace, who is earning this, disagrees, but Mason convinces her, and is ready to take responsibility for this without her knowledge of Nadia. Mason, Grace, and Carter are starting to meet Celeste and discuss it. At first, Celeste didn't want, but after being persuaded by Mason for her safety then, Celeste is willing to follow directions from Mason to erase her memory. Celeste takes to Oregon with a new life. Mason then meets Bernard to ask Celeste's memory too to be destroyed to permanently erase her memory, because Mason is very sure that Celeste has cheated the Citadel. Meanwhile, Nadia, who only knows Celeste, was moved to a safe house and immediately thanked Mason. Sometime after that, Carter told Mason turn out David didn't take the O's key, even Celeste also not, because what Carter found was a secret message against the protocol that said the operations team leader in hiding the O's key and directly assigned it to an agent, which turned out to be Nadia, and Mason knew about it. But Mason deliberately made Celeste lose her memory, not so that Celeste would divulge Citadel secrets. Instead, Mason wanted to make Celeste suspect, and Mason tried to protect Nadia. Back to Carter, who meets Nadia and Mason, who just found Carter in the situation locked up. So Carter meant to avoid and tell the two of them that whoever did all this was Nadia, an intruder who couldn't be trusted. Mason then asked that to Nadia, but Nadia was just silent. And then, the scene then continued by showing Nadia and Mason at the black site Manticore in Morocco to free Carter. Carter continues to say that if Nadia cannot be trusted, Mason is increasingly confused about what happened and what Nadia has been hiding all this time. And then, the scene begins to show flashbacks to 9 years earlier in Athens. Nadia and Mason were seen together and will carry out a mission. Suddenly, Nadia asked Mason about the O's key, and Mason said that if the O's key had been lost with David's departure at that time. And then Nadia asked Celeste to return from the safe house, but Mason felt if Celeste should still be there. And then, Mason discusses the mission that the two of them will carry out. Bernard assigns if they disguise themselves as a newly married couple, so they can quickly bring the Yakuza boss. And then Mason gives a ring to Nadia, but that turns out to be intentional. Mason, who proposes to Nadia, seriously wants to marry Nadia, but Nadia doesn't answer. Moves on to Bernard, who seems to have convinced Anders that the woman he loves is still alive. Anders believes that Bernard will take him to meet that woman. And then Anders agreed to free Bernard. But when the two of them were about to leave there, suddenly Anders was shot by Dahlia, who already knew full well the character of Anders, who must have acted rashly. Instantly, Anders died. After that, Dahlia approached Bernard. She admitted that Bernard was great at convincing someone to comply. But suddenly Bernard is discussing someone named Thomas. It makes Dahlia get angry to spit on Bernard. So Thomas is a legacy from Dahlia. And then Dahlia convinces that what she has done all this time still makes a spy from Citadel confess it and betray Citadel. Moves to 9 years earlier, it was seen that Nadia suddenly got a secret message from someone showing information that Celeste was not in a place that Nadia knew. Even Celeste was made memory loss of Bernard's knowledge. Seeing this surprised and angered her, so Nadia immediately went to Bernard to confirm it all and asked if Mason knew about Celeste. Bernard then tells it, and Nadia is disappointed with Mason, who was not honest with her. And then Nadia meets Mason and asks about that. At first, Mason didn't want to admit it, and after being forced by her, Manson admitted that he explained that he had done this on purpose to save Nadia, because he knew that Nadia was the one who brought the O's key. And Mason did that because he loved Nadia, even though Nadia might have been an intruder. Hearing this, Nadia was furious because it turned out that Mason didn't know her. Nadia admitted that the Oz key was in her hand before, but she destroyed it because she didn't trust anyone. After all, if the Oz key is in Citadel's hands, she doesn't believe too. Nadia then asks Celeste's memory to be returned, but it turns out that Mason has erased it, and then Nadia leaves Mason and gives a ring he gave her, which in essence, she rejects Mason's love. After that, she calls someone named Roddy and meets him. Nadia was given a passport and asked to go to Valencia with him. In addition, Roy asked Nadia to finish her business at Citadel immediately, then go away from the Citadel to Valencia with him. Nadia said that she would be clear about everything without knowing Mason. Back to the black site in Manticore, Carter explains to Mason that Nadia couldn't be trusted because she worked with the Manticore and met Rahi, a significant terrorist, a few days before the Citadel fell. Nadia was silent, didn't answer much, and asked the two of them to leave immediately from that place before the Manticore people came. The scene moved to Dahlia, who had lost her patience with Bernard, who didn't want to give the access code of Citadel. Dahlia immediately threatened the safety of Bernard and Mason's families. Bernard wasn't too affected, but after Dahlia pointed out the target point and just had to detonate it, Bernard finally gave in and gave the access code. After the access code got by Dahlia, who is the cunning person, still kills Bernard's family. Additionally, Bernard's family knows that Bernard is in danger because the security sensor at their residence went on. Bernard's wife and daughter immediately invited Abby and Hendrix to hurry up and leave the place. Meanwhile, Dahlia had just received news from David that the black side of Manticore had been successfully broken. So Carter was taken away by Nadia and Mason. Dahlia asks David to find Mason because the Manticore needs the nuclear code, which Mason knows. Dahlia also orders David and her subordinate to go to Valencia to Roddy. In addition, Dahlia tells David that Bernard killed by Bernard, who fled. Dahlia managed to make David angry and wanted revenge. Besides that, Nadia and Mason were seen taking Carter on a trip, but because Carter kept grumbling, he tried to stop because he didn't trust Nadia, who he believed was a prize defector. An annoyed Nadia immediately stopped the car and explained that she was not a deserter like Carter thought. So Nadia says that what she had been hiding, namely the presence of her child 8 years ago, she deliberately hid everything because she didn't want her daughter to be in danger. So along this time, she is pregnant and has a child with Mason, who deliberately doesn't talk about this to Mason. Nadia was in Valencia to give birth and take care of her child because it was there that Nadia thought was safe. After all, Raghib, whom she met, was Nadia's father. Hearing this, Mason was amazed because all this time, Nadia had never told him if they had a child. It was seen flashback to when Nadia was born her child. Nadia had to leave her baby for a while to continue the mission in Italy. Nadia entrusted her child to her father and gave a bracelet to her child as a sign that she was continuing to guard her. Back at this time, Nadia, who was in the middle of telling a story, was suddenly approached by Manticore people who immediately surrounded them. Still, the Manticore said there would be no commotion because someone wanted to talk to Mason. The conversation was continued, and it turned out that the one who spoke was Dahlia. Without wasting time, Dahlia also said that she needed Mason's help to provide a nuclear code on a giant submarine, and that code was only known to Mason. Dahlia also threatened that if Mason didn't want to, the guarantee was the safety of Mason's daughter and Nadia. The scene continued by showing flashbacks to 30 years ago in Serbia. It was seen that many people were being treated for severe injuries. A child also suffered minor injuries and just daydreamed as if he had been traumatized. 6 months later in Oregon, that child was still thinking about this incident, so he was often awake every night until the morning. In his room, when his grandmother came to him, that child said that he missed his father, who had died. Besides that, after his father died, his mother left him somewhere. That loneliness made a deep enough wound for the boy, and the boy was Mason. Mason Leave died by his father when he was a child, and his mother left as if Mason didn't exist. It goes to where Mason becomes a spy, and Citadel gives him an identity, until for him, it becomes nothing as an asset. Back in the present, as seen in Morocco, Mason, Nadia, and Carter are being brought in by Manticore people to follow the offer from Dahlia, because of Nadia's daughter and Mason under Dahlia's threats. When they all arrived at a hangar, Dahlia gave a scheme of her plan to Nadia and Carter to hack the submarine so that it was on the surface, so later Mason, accompanied by David, broke in to take 5 nuclear cores from the missile, and later brought them to the Spanish Manticore in exchange for Nadia's daughter. Hearing about the plan, Nadia was a little doubtful about Mason's ability, who was still losing his memory, but Dahlia emphasized through Carter that only Mason could access the submarine. Because during the previous Red Cell mission, Mason illegally made biometric access only for himself. A flashback to when the Red Cell mission was seen at headquarters 8 years ago, Grace explained that the target was Russian submarines. Citadel hacked that submarine to anticipate Russia launching the nuclear, but when Grace explained her plan, Mason seemed to continue to be anxious, thinking about Nadia, whose whereabouts were unknown. After that, Grace's assignment if Mason went down in the mission, and then the mission does it. Mason also carried out, with Carter's guidance, jumping on the submarine and locking the biometrics. However, it turned out that Mason illegally made the password private without Citadel's knowledge. That made only Mason, who now had to go down directly with the Manticore. The scene then changes when Mason and David jump from the plane. Mason loses his balance, so he almost falls. Fortunately, David immediately helped. After that, Mason unlocked the biometric lock and the password he had installed on that submarine. But after it was successfully opened, David immediately hit Mason until he was thrown. David then went inside to tamper with the missile system and immediately contacted Dahlia. It turned out that David knew that his brother Anders was killed by Dahlia. So now, David threatens to destroy the Manticore if she doesn't give him power. But Dahlia doesn't care about that and immediately threatens to kill David. It was C. Mason who was unconscious and now had woken up and pointed a gun at David. And then suddenly Nadia came and hit David until he fainted. Then Nadia went into the missile room to cancel the launch by taking the missile cores one by one. With only a few minutes remaining in the room so hard to breathe, Nadia carefully started removing the core parts one by one missile. But Nadia began to have trouble breathing and ran out of oxygen. Luckily, with 5 seconds left, she pulled the last core part and aborted the launch. Meanwhile, it was seen that David was already woken up and immediately beat Mason. Mason was having difficulty facing David. When Mason was cornered and almost finished off, Carter continued to suggest to him that Mason would remember all the strength he had. That success made him stronger and easily killed David. Mason then rushed to come to Nadia, who was almost out of breath, and Mason immediately took her outside. The scene then flashbacks 8 years ago at the Citadel headquarters. Grace is seen as disappointed in Mason, who suddenly lost communication during a mission. Even the missile became locked so that Citadel could not control the rocket. Mason also said he could only control the missile with the secondary protocol he had set. It turned out that this was deliberately done by Mason so that Grace would want to tell the whereabouts of Nadia. Grace again confirmed what Grace knew. Nadia was in Berlin, and Mason, who still didn't believe it, immediately left the base just like that. Next, in the present, Mason, Nadia, and Carter had planned something for a meeting with the Manticore people in exchange for missile cores and Nadia's daughter. Arriving in Valencia, the meeting place, Carter deliberately went upstairs and used a rifle on standby. At the same time, Nadia and Mason come to Christopher and bring the missile core. And then, seen above a different place, Nadia's daughter is above in the hands of the Manticore. When the Manticore is off guard, Carter shoots him, and Nadia's daughter is saved. Christopher then runs away, and the Manticore mission can fail. Nadia is so grateful to meet her daughter again, and they also rush to go away. The scene changed to 8 years ago, when Mason met Bernard. There, Bernard told him about Nadia's existence in Spain, who already had a child, and that was Mason's child. Bernard suggested that Mason go to meet Nadia. Mason is shocked because he doesn't know it, and Mason doubts if he has come to Nadia, because previously, Nadia rejected his love. Meanwhile, it can be seen that Dahlia, who is upset because of the failure, decides to leave her base and blows up the base to remove traces of the Manticore people. At the same time, it was seen that Mason, Carter, Nadia, and her daughter decided to go to the Citadel headquarters first. When they arrived, it turned out that the bases were only ruins after the collapse. Not long after, Abby came and her daughter, who was so happy if Mason was still alive. Nadia and Carter are shocked because Abby she knows is Celeste, who is Nadia's best friend. It turns out that she is Mason's wife, even though they both pretend not to know and are happy. And then Carter finds Mason's memory tube, which turns out to be still in the backup. Mason decides to use the box because he wants to remember who Mason is. After being used, Mason's memories can be slowly returned. His relationship with Nadia is so close until Abby, who is Celeste. Besides that, the most shocking memory is when Mason meets Dahlia to ask for help to find Nadia's whereabouts. And from the conversation between them, it was revealed that Dahlia was Mason's biological mother, who left Mason when he was a child. Dahlia discussed the death of Mason's father, who was alleged because of Citadel, which exploded terror in Serbia. So Dahlia was on Manticore's side, wanting to avenge her husband's death. With this, Dahlia also took advantage and asked Mason to provide secret Citadel files. Mason was instigated to provide various lists of Citadel spies, so that the Manticore made the agents die, and the Citadel collapsed. It turns out that the betrayed person in Citadel is Mason, and the film ends.